So, I rise to address this august assembly. In the previous years, I've talked about apnea and stuff like that until it gets excruciatingly boring, both on my part and on the recipient's part of hearing the same thing over. So this time, Peter Vanitini wanted to organize things where we talked about controversial or semi-controversial things. And so I'm going to talk about something that you might have heard of, the dead salmon's fMRI poster and paper of 2009, and then something that I call the Great Cluster Panic of 2016. And the panic is really the kind of the word here. I mean, that the sky is falling, at least briefly, was the kind attitude in certain places. So there's two parts to this. So this is the screen opening on Act 1, the dead salmon stuff, and that is in 2009 at Human Brain Mapping, there was this poster, which most people thought was a joke poster, and then kind of it was, right? But where these people, some piteous place like Dartmouth, were testing out their scanner, and they bought and instead of doing an fMRI scan on a bottle of water or something, in the Phantom, they said, "Here, let's do something fun." They went to the supermarket or fish market and bought a whole salmon and put it in the scanner, which you can scan that as well as you can scan a bottle of water. I don't think you're required to get a consent form from a dead salmon, so there you are. IRB maybe, but and the task was they showed the salmon a picture of human faces, a series of human faces, and told the salmon to judge whether they were happy or sad faces, or so. I mean, whatever it was. I'm sure they were probably imbibing stuff at the same time. But in any case, not to say anything against them, of course. But and then they analyzed, but they got the fMRI scan, so they have a time series of data. Boom, 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 right? And then they analyze that with SPM. I mean, you could analyze data from a bottle of water. In fact, it gets done here all the time. And then you analyze it with SPM, and you threshold the voxels. You got every voxel gets said, how well did it fit this task timing, right? That's the whole thing. We have this model of time. This is task on, task off, task on, task off, up, down, up, down, up, down. How well does it fit? And then the per voxel p-value less than 0.001, and that's active in as the word goes, or correlated. And there's a link there to the poster, and you can see I highlighted these because I wasn't sure how well they would appear on the screen because of the dark red color. They actually appear better on that screen than they do on mine. Those are some of the voxels they found. This is this is just cut right out of their thing. We're actually interested in getting their data. It was 10 years old and was a graduate student. And I mean, finding data that's 10 years old was what kind of joke data is probably going to be hard. But in any case, so that was, by the way, that was my dead salmon. A different dead salmon was my dinner on Sunday. So the popular perception, New York Times. This is just cut right out of the New York Times article, which you can still, because of the massive power of the Google, you find right away, right? I'm not going to read all this aloud. I assume that you're all literate, reasonably literate. But this was made glaringly apparent back in 2009 when a graduate student conducted an fMRI scan of a dead salmon and found neural activity in its brain when it was shown photographs of human and social situations. Again, it was a salmon, and it was dead. So this isn't a longer opinion piece about how about the unreliability of fMRI. Well, New York Times, which I have a subscription to, got it almost exactly wrong. I don't think it's 180 degrees off of the actual situation, but it's more like about 175 anyway. Wired magazine was not so far off, but it still obfuscates. They actually interviewed the graduate student, and the result is completely nuts, but that's the point. And then go farther down. They wanted to call attention to ways the field could improve its statistical methods. Wired is closer here, but it still obfuscates the reality that it could improve its statistical methods. And I'll show you, because I'm moving from the false interpretations towards the correct interpretation, what I believe is the correct interpretation. Lazy people still bring this stuff up. And they say, that proves fMRI is unreliable. Why would we ever trust anything from fMRI? But not every popular publication is off base. The Scientific American talks about this. It's actually a study to show the importance of correcting your stats. What I mean in detail about the correction will be on later slides, because you have to suffer something here. You know, like there will be. I don't think I actually have any equations though. Probably they'll take my math PhD away. These are quotes from the authors. This is what they meant. If you controlled for the family-wise error, or which is a statistical term for the family of tests across the entire volume, a statistical test, not voxel-wise, but volume-wise. If you control for that using any one of a bunch of methods, then nothing survives, which is what you'd expect, because there shouldn't be anything. At least you shouldn't expect it very often. Okay. Then they say, we argue that relying on standard statistical thresholds was ineffective. What they meant there is actually, though, they were were methods, that ad hoc methods that they basically were people who copied something. Someone wrote a paper. In their particular case, they used this method, and therefore other people would just copy that blindly, even though it didn't really apply to this new case. And so we argue the vast majority of fMRI studies should utilize proper multiple comparisons. That's a little hard to argue with, especially when you put the word proper in, right? It's hard to argue with proper, I think. But the reason, and they really say in their paper, the reason they made a deal out of this as opposed to just having fun, which I'm sure they did too, but that is, a lot of papers using fMRI didn't use any reasonable attempt. That is, they used ad hoc attempts or no attempts at all. And that was especially true in journals where people were publishing fMRI studies in cognitive neuroscience or other neuroscience fields where they'd never seen much in the way of volumetric imaging field studies before. And so they weren't being properly reviewed. I mean, they'd be reviewed for their neuroscience content, not for their methods content. This doesn't apply so much anymore, I think, although I'm sure you can still find such articles. But it was a valid point. But the point that the popular press took from it ranged from saying fMRI is unreliable garbage, is still around, and that's 10 years later now, 2009. Even though, of course, if you're a follower of, deconstructionist theory or not post-structuralism, then anyone's interpretation of a text is a valid interpretation, not just the author's. But I don't think we can go that far in science yet, because otherwise, why are we bothering to do this? Now I'll move on to the second act, which is considerably lengthier. If there are any questions, please. I mean, I'm not a very threatening person, I hope. I could be, if I put my mind to it, but it would just be a lot of effort. I'm going to talk about the Great Cluster Panic of 2016. And that's a lot more serious because it brought up real issues, whereas the other thing, the Salmon thing, I think was bringing up issues that were already fading away. That is, to remind people that multiple correction for multiple comparisons is an important issue when you're doing tens of thousands of comparisons, making statistical decisions about tens of thousands of places at once. And this is a problem, of course, in genetics too, where you make statistical decisions about thousands of genes at once. So. This study was a much more serious study and not just an ad hoc, let's scan a dead salmon this afternoon study. But it also was overhyped and also poorly popularized. And I'm going to describe the methods. So they took a lot of resting state fMRI data sets from actual living human beings, not deceased fish. And they analyzed these resting states. So they put someone in the scanner, and your instruction is lie there and do nothing. Turn your brain off, or think about chocolate or something. And that would actually be a task, I suppose. Then analyze it as if they were tasks. Just make up some task timing. The idea is that this is the closest thing we have in fMRI to real noise, as opposed to synthetic simulations, which we can make up out the kazoo, but they're made up, and so they're not going to have all the properties of real fMRI data. So this is real fMRI data, and it doesn't have any tasks. So we just make up some task timing. We pretend, on, off, analyze them. So this, when I say many, they had 198 subjects. Then you analyze those, each individual subject, and you basically, the individual subject analysis, you boil those down to individual subject maps from 100 and 200 or so volumes in a time series down to the percent signal change relative to the task timing. So 200 volumes boiled down to 1 for each subject. Now we have 198 subjects. So then we analyze those as if they were a group analysis. So we don't analyze all 198, we take a subset of those, say 20. Take 20 random ones of those out. That's a small fMRI study. 20, analyze that and apply some whatever thresholding algorithm is your favorite one. And then anything that survives that, you say that's a false positive because there was no real task. And then you do that over and over again. Take another random 20 out of the 198, and another random 20. And so do that 1,000 times. And so this is a lot more serious than analyzing one salmon, right? Less tasty, too, I imagine. But analyze this. And so the idea is that people normally set the threshold settings to give a nominal false positive rate or family-wise error rate of 5%. That is, if I should get around 50 cases when I do 1,000 such analyses, do 1,000 fMRI studies like this, then I should have about 50 false positives. Not exactly, of course, but 300 is way off 50. 60 would be reasonable, and 5 would not be reasonable. That means you're being too conservative. The purpose of one of the purposes of statistics is to control the error rate. And we'd like to have no errors, and I can guarantee there are no false positives by saying there are no positives. But that's not very useful, because why do you gather data? So the control or estimate the false positive rate is one of the goals of statistics. And so if you want to say, I want a 5% false positive rate, you should get about that. You shouldn't get a 1% rate, because that means you're being too conservative. Because after all, fewer false positives probably means fewer true positives. So in any case, so if all is well in the world of fMRI data analysis, then you should find about 50 false positives out of 1,000 such simulations. So this is a moderately lengthy computation, as you can imagine. First, you have to analyze the 188 subjects, and then when you do anything like that, of course, a few of the analyses fail because of something happens on the computer, or you screwed your script up or something. And then after you do that, you have to write a script to choose random subsets and run 1,000 of those, and some of those will screw up, so you have to patch that up. But when you're done, and this is not for what you do, use a cluster so it doesn't take 1,000,000 years or 1,000 years. And then, so these people, Anders Eklund and Tom Nichols, carried out this analysis using AFNI, FSL, and SPM. And to their credit, they put all their scripts that they analyzed on GitHub, so someone could duplicate their work. Here's exactly how they ran AFNI to do the individual subject analysis and to do these group analyses. So the Great Cluster Panic. This is from their paper in PNAS, which is indicated here. This is so. As I said, we should have about a 5% false positive rate. Now that 5% is this black bar, and then sort of a 95% confidence interval of 50 times out of 1,000. There should be sort of a plus or minus 14 for for the 95% confidence interval just from random sampling theory, then this is the error bars on that. And notice that the error bars, the actual error rate is a little bit over 5%. This is what causes the great cluster panic. And this, though, there's more than one way to carry out fMRI thresholding, and I'm going to discuss those in a little bit of detail coming up. But one of these is what they call the CDT, which is cluster determining threshold. I personally call that the voxel-wise or per voxel threshold, which I think is slightly more communicative than cluster determining threshold. What that is the technique involved, which I have a slide on later, is I call dual thresholding. That is, you threshold the voxels at some threshold. How well did it fit this up and down curve? And then the t-test in the group. So here's the group of 20 subjects. Was the average activation in this voxel not 0? That's a t-test against 0, a one sample t-test. Or I could have two groups, 20 here, 20 random subjects, 20 different random subjects. In this voxel, the average of these, is it different than the average of these? That's a two sample t-test, right? And in each voxel, we get a t-statistic. We can threshold that at some p-value, and that's the cluster determining threshold. The second step, that's the first step of thresholding. The second step is all the voxels that are isolated off little tiny patches we throw away. That's the clusterizing step. We say only big clusters survive. The purpose of the two thresholds is to control the false positive rate. Because if I want to say I want one threshold to control the false positive rate, I have to make my p-value so stringent that I'm not going to see much. You will see primary visual, primary auditory, primary motor if you have a nice solid block design like finger tapping, to choose an example. But you won't see cognitive areas. They just don't have a significant, as anywhere near as big a bold change. So if you're going to do per voxel testing on the whole brain, life is hard. Need more data. Need more data. Send more money. Okay. So the cluster determining threshold in this one, the bad looking one, where everything is way up around in the 20 to 30 range, which is way above 5%, is a fairly non-stringent per voxel threshold of 0.01. If we're stricter, say 0.001. So here, per voxel threshold 0.001, all these things collapse downward, right? They're still mostly above this green band, but they're not grotesquely above the green band. But there was a lot of the false positive rate was way above 5%, especially in this case, especially here, and there was a lot of doom crying about this. So kind of thing. And the thing is, I mean, this was sparked, and deliberately, in my opinion, by the authors of the paper, deliberately, that they said that in the very front of their paper, they said these results question the validity of some 40,000 fMRI studies. That is all fMRI studies ever conducted up until 2016. They retracted that statement within a week because they got a lot of pushback, as you might well imagine. But it was there, and that is the thing that sparked a large number of articles in the popular press about this. A quote from the title of an article in Science Alert, for example, is "Could invalidate 15 years of brain research," which is a lot of brain research. New York Times, that one about the dead salmon from the New York Times, that was actually not the article they had about this, but they were calling out the dead salmon stuff too. And so on. There were a lot of articles. The Atlantic had one, at least the Atlantic Online, and Wired, of course, and so on. So the fMRI is doomed, So forgetting the popular press, the great cluster panic continues. The response by journals was pretty much that at least a lot of journals, that they would require a per voxel p-value threshold of 0.001 or more stringent. I mean, it can always be more strict. The response by SPM people was p equals 0.01 here, nothing to see, and we have finesse. I mean, literally, that's what they said in their paper, the word finesse, that is. If you use finesse, then things are okay. I'm quite literally true. It's quite literally true. The response by FSL is we're fine with p equals 0.001 after a little harumphing by Steve Smith, at least to me in person. The response by me, I took this a lot more seriously, as you'll see. But first, first I want to have a little background about exactly what's going on. So this is recapitulating what I said a few minutes ago. We did the first level time series on each subject's data separately. This is the normal, classical way of doing fMRI analysis. That is, we have, say, the 20 subjects in one group. In each voxel, we have several hundred time points, and we analyze it to see how well it fits our time model of, on-off. In this case, it was a simple on-off task. In a more complicated case, you might get more than one thing out of each voxel. But in this simple case here, we just get one number out of each voxel. How much did it fit this stuff? Of course, these are all transformed to some common templates so that the different people's brains line up as best as we can. And then the second level group analysis is carried out on these voxel beta values, which in AFNI are percent signal changes. This is not ROI-based analysis, which is a completely separate topic. So if you wanted to get a global false positive rate, that is inside the brain mask, there's only a 5% chance of even a single false voxel surviving the threshold, you have to be pretty strict. And this was realized extremely early in fMRI because people wouldn't see anything, which is kind of annoying. So a solution to that was formed very early in the fMRI days, and that is to form the clusters of neighboring voxels. That is, we threshold, like I said, we threshold as some per voxel p-value of 0.001, for example. Now you say that's a pretty strict threshold, but if you have 100,000 voxels, and 0.001 times 100,000 means there's 100, just from random noise alone, there's 100 voxels come up. Remember, false positive rate is what kind of probability do I have of getting something that looks like an activation when I'm just feeding noise in. But not random, not purely white noise. I mean, noise that's structured like real fMRI data, because that's what we live with, right? Not, synthetic white noise, which is easy to deal with accurately. So, but the solution then was to cluster things together. That is to say, we're going to threshold 0.001, say. So there's still some false positives, but they're unlikely to be next to each other either. If you do that, you'll find tiny little, just on, say, a bottle of water or something, you find these little isolated things, 1 or 2 voxels. And then we're going to say, I'm only going to take stuff that's next to each other, at least at some cluster size threshold, like at least 27 voxels, for example. So that's the cluster threshold. And if you imagine if I make a less strict, instead of saying 0.001 per voxel, I say 0.01, 10 times more likely for false positives. I'm going to have more false positives just from noise, right? So I have to have a larger cluster size threshold to balance these two off. We have 2 thresholds, which is why I cleverly call this the dual threshold method. One balances off the other, right? In clustering can be thought of as doing a couple of things at once. One is that it's correcting for the voxel-wise statistics, the 100 false positives or the 1,000 false positives you will get, which they got in the Salmon, right? And it's correcting for that because we'll have too many false positives. So we're correcting for that by saying, no, they got to be next to each other too. And there's got to be a certain number of them next to each other. And what is that? Where does that number come from? That's a different story, and I'll get into that in a minute. But because the per voxel threshold is easy. If I want a per voxel threshold of 0.001, this is a t statistic. You can look it up in a table, except nobody uses tables anymore that use a formula or a computer program that has a formula written into it. So 3.472. There you go. For 0.001. There you go, fine. Don't quote me on that. That's a number I just made up. If you walk out of here and use 3.472, then I failed. That's clear. Okay, got that? So, and then you threshold in the cluster size as well. Or you could use some other cluster FOM, figure of merit, which is a jargon that's not used much in the this literature, but when in my old days in radar signal processing, figure of merit was a really big term back in the 80s when I did that kind of stuff. But so we reject these small, weak, isolated clusters. So, and then we have to adjust the cluster threshold, the cluster size or the cluster figure of merit threshold to get some desired global false positive rate. Because the p-value is the per voxel false positive rate, but our goal is the volume-wise global false positive rate. So, but even if you do this, the dual threshold method, it can be weak. It has, that is to say, it has low power to detect. So the other solution, the second part of the solution, is to use spatial blurring, which is at least approximately is like in averaging together the beta values from neighboring voxels. That is to say, if we expect, we're looking for regions, not the one magical voxel which says, that this is where you remember your grandmother. That's the famous grandmother neuron voxel, right? We average those together. We expect them to be roughly similar, and things and place over here, which doesn't care about your grandmother. All those voxels, they're just going to be random stuff. When I average them together, they'll tend to get closer to 0, which will make them less significant. And so it reduces the spatial noise by averaging, and it reinforces commonality when the voxels next to each other are roughly similar. This also reduces the effective number of statistical tests, because when I start averaging the voxels together, the noise in them isn't independent anymore. When people say they're not independent, what they mean is the noise is not independent. It's important to keep in fact, we're talking about noise mostly here, not signal. Noise, because noise is the enemy of detection, and we're trying to determine what the effect of the noise is. So when people talk about correlation here, and stuff like that, it's correlation of noise, not correlation of signal. Unlike resting state fMRI, where we talk about correlation of signal, for example. So they use the same word for two entirely different concepts. That's good too. And this also, though, selects a minimum spatial scale of what we're looking for. If I blur things with a radius of 6 millimeters, then I'm not going to see anything that's smaller than 6 millimeters when I'm done, right? It's going to be blurred together. So again, this is implicitly opposing a spatial model of activation. And this kind of ad hoc thing is all due to the fact that we don't really have a decent mathematical model for spatial activation patterns versus time, where we have this temporal model, up and down. Show your grandmother's face, show a picture of an elephant. Show grandmother's face, picture of an elephant. Goes up less, because elephants are somewhat less interesting than your grandmother, and so on, like that. So like that, that we have a decent time model. It's not perfect, but it's decent. We don't have any model except sort of in our head, like little random stuff. We don't want that. That's the clustering. Checkerboard. If you saw an activation pattern that looked like a checkerboard, you would not think, wow, I am a Nobel Prize winner here. You would think there's an artifact in my data. Because if you thought you were a Nobel Prize winner, you should choose a different field of science, right? Artifact in the data. And I have seen things with artifacts like that in the data that come from multiband excitations that are not proper, or reconstruction. Maybe it's not proper. One of the two. But we don't really have a spatial model, that we believe. To the extent that you believe one, that ends up turning into ROI analysis, which is a different subject. So, but we're implicitly imposing some sort of spatial model with clustering, and with smoothing, we're implicitly saying, well, we're only going to look for stuff that's a certain size or bigger, of course. But it's important to know what restrictions you're putting on your possible results. Here's a cartoon example of 1D thresholding, not image. So if we had along here, this is actually some real data, T statistics smoothed across space in a single slice. We have all this black data here. We set the threshold here, then these are the clusters that would survive. And then if we had a cluster size threshold, then we'd say, oh, this cluster is too small, maybe it's out. And then if we have a higher threshold, that's what survive, and a yet higher threshold, that's what would survive. Basically, we're only looking we're raising the sea level until we're raising the sea level and see what mountains survive, right? Well, the problems arise in how the cluster threshold is calculated. As the p-value, per voxel p-value threshold from the t-statistic is nothing. It's a trivial calculation. But the cluster threshold is not a trivial calculation. In the past, and it is still done, for that matter, in some pieces of software, the cluster threshold, remember I said it depends on the p-value threshold. Strict p-value threshold, lenient, cluster small, very strict, 0.001 per voxel threshold. Cluster size threshold can be small. But if I'm very loose on the per voxel 0.01, 10 times looser, then I have to be correspondingly stricter on the cluster size threshold to balance, to get the final false positive rate, say, at 5%. So that the cluster threshold will be a function of the per voxel p-value threshold. Traditionally, that has been based on a mathematical model of the spatial distribution of the fMRI noise. That is something that's called the spatial autocorrelation function of the noise. That is how well correlated is the noise here with the noise there and then farther away and so on. You'd think that as you go farther away, it tends to fall off, which is true, of course. Because anything is correlated with itself 100%. So it's 1 here, and as I go farther away, it's going to drop down smaller and smaller and smaller. And again, we want to determine the chance of finding anything in noise-only volumes. That's what the goal is. And so we have a mathematical model for the spatial distribution of noise. That's what we need for clusters, right? Because clusters are space. The difficulty with this approach, well, there's two. One is, the small one is that even given a mathematical model, calculating a formula for the cluster size threshold isn't so easy. But that's a minor problem. A bigger problem is that a good model, that is one that's an accurate model for real fMRI data, is essentially non-existent, actually. That's the problem. Hard to get. A mathematician will say, the technical term that mathematicians use is difficult. Difficult means, to a mathematician, impossible, but it's not actually been proven to be impossible. So an alternative approach is to instead of, you can think of the mathematical model as being a formula, a recipe for creating synthetic noise-only data, just from the formula of the distribution of the noise. And then you could imagine here I can create thousands of volumes in synthetic, 1,000 volumes in synthetic noise, right? And then I can go through and threshold them with a p of 0.001, say, and find out how many clusters, different sizes survive, and figure out what the cluster size threshold should be. It's actually relatively straightforward. Of course, there's a computer program keeping track of that. It's kind of complicated, but that's just what computer programmers people do. It's a way of getting noise-only volumes to test. Any positives that come out of the data analysis of noise-only volumes are false by definition. So the alternative approach is to take the actual data and randomize it, not in space, but between subjects, in order to produce synthetic examples of noise-only volumes, but synthetic from real data, and then analyze those volumes instead of creating them out of nothing, ab initio or ab ova from a mathematical model. We'll randomize and create them from data that has the spatial structure of our own data, because it is our own data, but randomized so it doesn't have any group differences, for example, anymore. If you have one group, when we randomize the signs of the data, so like you expect, we're saying, well, we're going to look for places where the average signal in all the subjects at this voxel is it different from 0. That's the t-test, right? The one sample t-test. And so if we randomize the signs, then the average will tend to be 0, right? Because they're now, if they were all around 0.5% signal change, 0.5%, 0.3%, 0.8%, and so on. But now some of them are going to be negative and some will be positive, and so those will be pseudo noise, and we analyze those volumes, and A two-group analysis, you can also permute the subjects between groups. That is, two-group analysis of patients and extremely handsome people like everyone in this room. Okay, so then the patients and the extremely handsome people, we can randomize the people between the groups. And so then, so we're looking for a systematic difference between all of you extremely handsome people and the patients over in the next room, then now we randomize between the groups, the systematic differences will be gone. So that's a kind of synthetic noise too, right? And then we use those as our pseudo noise volumes and threshold those at point, say, we just do the t-tests on these randomized collections. We're going to do a 20 sample t-test, and I'm going to do it 10,000 times, not on every voxel. How long does that take? A few minutes. What is a t-test? You average things. You calculate the standard deviation, which is averaging their squares. So it's multiply and add. That's what computers, CPUs are built for, is multiply and add. They do this very fast. So you can do hundreds of thousands of t-tests, tens of thousands of times in a few minutes. This is brute force. And then we threshold those things to calculate what the cluster threshold is. If you do that, then you get, this is a chart that's analogous to the one in the Eklund paper of 2016, except if you notice the scale here doesn't go up to like 70% because it would be absurdly like that big. You know, we go back, so this is at the cluster determining threshold in their terminology of 0.01 and down to 0.001. We did, you know, all 10 of the ones, 0.01, 0.02, and so on. But this is just some of them. They're all where they should be, right? We go back here, this is what they were before in various pieces of software. Now my scale is up here because otherwise it would be absurd to look at. While I was doing this, though, then it occurred to me that, you know, there's this kind of arbitrary threshold that I mentioned. The p equals 0.001 or p equals 0.01. Well, with this permutation approach, now p equals 0.01 is still acceptable. False positive rate is controlled. But where does this threshold come from? I mean, at 0.0, if you go much smaller than 0.001, you're getting into the range where your cluster size threshold becomes like 2 voxels or something, because you're getting into the range where per voxel significance is actually very strong. Certainly if you go to 10 to the minus 4, you're really getting pretty strong. But sort of a decent range, kind of a common range, is somewhere between 0.001 or maybe a little bit smaller and 0.01. Much larger is kind of getting screwy, in my opinion, because there's so many voxels to test. But there's this range, and where does it come from? People just choose what they want, which is sort of like literally p hacking, or I'm choosing the p. I'm choosing the p. I'm hacking on the p itself. Ha! Boy, great. Sounds like fun, huh? I don't think that people, well, some people may do this dishonestly, other people may just do it without even thinking. Well, the idea that came to me was to use many p-value thresholds, let's say 10 of them from 0.001 up to 0.01. So I do that, I get 10 brain maps, right? And then I cluster threshold each of those separately in exactly the same way that I just discussed in the previous 2 slides. And then I merge their results. And then I have to, but even if each one of those was 5% false positive rate, when I merge them, it'll be bigger than 5%. So I have to adjust those thresholds in order to keep the global false positive rate at 5%, which is, or whatever percent is your religion of the week. So that has to be adjusted. Well, how is that done? By Moore simulation, brute force simulation. One of my favorite subjects. This eliminates the choice, though, or at least reduces the choice of an arbitrary p-value threshold for the. You could do the same for the blurring. This occurred to me also, that you can use multiple blurring cases, 4, 6, and 8 millimeters, say, and merge the results across blurs and thresholds. And so this then reduces 2 arbitrary parameters in the final group analysis. There's no particularly good reason to choose either any particular value in these sort of plausible ranges. That is, you wouldn't choose blurring of 20 millimeters because the brain itself from here to there is only about 120 millimeters. So if you blurred 20 millimeters, you'd have like 5 effective voxels across the whole brain. And why are you doing fMRI? So there's a plausible range for blurring, and obviously you can't blur smaller than your voxel size because that's your sort of minimum scale of anything, right? So there's a plausible range, and there's a plausible range for p-values. But if you do this, then you can imagine finding small clusters that are very significant in a per voxel level, and larger clusters that are not significant so significant on a per voxel level, that need a less strict p-value, but are bigger. Now, finding a small weak cluster, well, you're doomed, right? You can't have everything. So the program that does this in AFNI is called ETAC, which is an acronym that it took me a long time to come up with because I wanted something that was pronounceable. But like AFNI itself is pronounceable. That's an important thing in acronyms, in my opinion. So anyway, this basically shows that if you set the program to say false positive rate of 1%, 2%, up to 9%, it delivers on that. And here I was using 3 blurs, 4, 7, and 10 millimeters, and 10 Ps at once. So 30 maps are created. Each single circle or square on this is 1,000 simulations, each of which has 10,000 sub-simulations inside of it. So it takes a while to generate this figure. It takes about a day of computation on the BioWolf. An entire day of running on the maximum number of nodes they'll give me, which is about 500, each with 16 CPUs. Last quarter, when I made that figure, I used 500,000 CPU hours of time on the BioWolf. So far this quarter, I think I've used 10. So, so this is the last important slide. fMRI, these panics come around every few years. Earlier panics, the voodoo correlation panic. And at least twice there's been head motion artifact panics, calling into question the very existence of their souls, practically. In every case, there's a real point deserving response. The voodoo correlations brought up a real point, but and in every case, they're overhyped and oversold and make people over-anxious, especially if it gets into the popular press, where it tends to be somewhat distorted. And voodoo correlations were a real phenomenon, but people over-worried about them. Head motion artifacts are a real problem, but people were talking, I don't remember what it was, 2013 or something, about how how it was going to ruin resting state fMRI or something. Notice that people still do a lot of resting state fMRI, so somehow that didn't actually happen. Where does this anxiety come from? This is, now we're moving into psychology, which is definitely not my field. My PhD is in math, and like most mathematicians, I went into math partly because I liked it and I'm very good at it, and partly because people don't get along with people that way. Except Armin, of course. You wanted a shout out, there you get it. In my opinion, it's rooted in the fact we don't really know what we're measuring with fMRI. That is, at how it relates to the real brain activity. We just don't know. We have some ideas, of course, but only crude ideas, and we're measuring things at a very big scale, even in the tiniest voxels, compared to the people who deal with individual neurons. And each individual neuron is, as they will endlessly point out to you, is an incredibly complicated device. And then we look in a 1 millimeter cube patch, and how many neurons are in that? Several 100,000. And so we're looking at some sort of collective proxy for that, which is some sort of changes in the blood, mostly oxygen, but through space effects and flow and stuff like that, that are caused by that. And then we're not measuring that directly. Even we're measuring its effects on a microscopic magnetic field. So we're at least 2 steps removed from real brain activity in ways that are hard, even after 20 years of work by Peter Manatini, one of the smartest people I know, is that we still don't really know what we're measuring relative to those damn electrodes stuck in there. And of course, they don't know what they're measuring either. So at least they're measuring electrical stuff. But it's the worst functional brain mapping method except for all the others that you can think of. That's the main drawback, main thing. We don't have the stuff in Star Trek where they apparently measure every neuron all at once, and then can simulate an entire human brain. I think we're a ways away from that, forever. But I think it's rooted in the fact that we don't know where, so that someone brings something up and says it with impressive computations and with some truth to it, then it resonates, over-resonates. It ties into somewhat insecurity, I think. And then, of course, there's the popular press, which, that is, whenever if you read something in the newspaper and it's a field you actually know something about, you realize that at best it's somewhat off. And often it's really off, but at best it's usually distorted, and they're missing something that I don't know what can be done about that. Nothing, I think, because otherwise you have a ministry of truth. But anyway, my ideas for clustering started here, walking in the Grand Canyon. This is a hike to a side canyon, which you can see off on the side here. This is called Clear Creek Canyon. There's which runs down into the main Grand Canyon, which is off the bottom right of the slide. And this is the trail. And this picture was taken approximately by my wife, approximately the time when my sister, who was behind me, was saying, Bob, you haven't said anything for like the last hour and a half. What are you thinking about? And I was thinking about clustering. Which is possibly not the most exciting thing to think about. This is a really beautiful place, as you can see. This is a day and a half's walk into the Grand Canyon. And we hiked in and we camped down at Clear Creek, where there's fresh water, which is an important thing because it's otherwise a desert. And it was a great trip, and not just because I thought about clustering, because I got away from, like filling out government forms and answering emails and stuff. But so that's where it started, and this is where it ends, I guess. So, anyway, that's all I have to say. But I'm happy to discuss this further. Peter wanted discussions, and Peter's raising his hand.
I thought you were going to mention that picture. I thought you were going to mention with that picture that the peaks look like activations.
Oh.
And
That never even
cluster
occurred.
levels.
That never even occurred to me, actually, because
But so I have 1 point and 1 question, and that is, typically also when people write their papers, another big reason why they do that is that to get something in the PNAS, you have to state how significant it could be, and so I think that sometimes people overstate the significance of their warnings, and then that's picked up by the popular press.
Yeah, I think that the reason it was picked up in the press was this thing that I quoted, that calls into question 40,000 papers or something. And although that was essentially immediately retracted, that the press didn't know this. And if I was actually interviewed, I don't think anything came of it, by some online Alzheimer's magazine, and the woman who interviewed me, it clearly read the PNAS paper, which is only 4 pages, that's their page limit. And they have this extensive online supplement. And if you read the online supplement, things were a lot more nuanced than they were in the paper. But nobody reads the online supplement except for people like me who want to try and duplicate the work. Or otherwise, the online supplement might as well just be stored on a server on Pluto or something.
So So yeah, I think Vox called me up and asked me questions about this, and my answer to this was, I didn't really. So yes, you might have this cluster threshold issue, and then so with each people's results, they might have a few more voxels than they expect. But then I guess my main point there was, how many of those really would have altered the conclusions of the paper? It's a matter of, they might have, but it's maybe a handful at the most. But so have you done like an actual map comparison? I mean, comparison of how the maps actually look without the correction and with the correction?
No, not what sort of the before and after picture.
Yeah.
No, I haven't done that actually.
Because that would be a pretty.
That would be. You have to do that with real task data, I think, not on the resting, because anything is garbage in resting
Right.
state, right?
Yeah. So you'd have to have real task, but then
Yeah.
kind of show like, look, sure, things are a little different, but overall the maps are pretty much the same.
Yeah, that would be a good task. However, I must say that I am entirely sick to the point of nausea of the clustering issue, and I don't really actually want to engage it intellectually anymore. And so someone else will have to do this. It's an excellent idea, but it is not something that I am personally going to invest any mental energy into. Yes.
Is this, yeah. So, although you don't want to engage with it anymore, I still have a question about one of the things
Okay,
you presented.
I have 10 minutes of engaging with it, and then I'm out the door.
So, you talked about merging in the ETAC approach.
Yes.
And I'm curious what you mean by merging. Like, how are you actually merging? Is it,
You
how
haven't
do
read
you
my
combine?
paper?
Sorry.
Ah, shock horror. Oh, merging is just the union of all the maps.
Okay.
The binary, and I mean, you say if it's any voxel that survives in any of those maps survives the merger. You can imagine all sorts of merger.
But if a voxel survives from all of them, then you believe it.
That would be the
presumably?
if it survived from all of them, that would be the intersection, right?
Yeah.
And I'd use the union map because I think my idea was that strong things that are over a limited region that would survive a strict, a stringent per voxel threshold, which should have a small cluster size threshold, would survive this union map, but they wouldn't survive an intersection map where only the big stuff would survive. So that was my reason for that. You could imagine a voting system where it has to be at least 2 or something, but that would be another rabbit hole to go down.
Okay.
And so I decided to use the union. I mean, there's a whole bunch of technical decisions that had to be made in this process. Like, what is the actual procedure for determining that that you do the cluster size thresholds with this union map are going to give the desired false positive rate, and that actually took when I was walking in the Grand Canyon and in the following week in a place called Browns Pass in Colorado. I thought it would be easy. When I got back here and actually tried to write it down, it all was easy until I got to that point, and then I said, I have no idea how to actually do that. And then that took me several days of thought to overcome that sort of brick wall that I ran into. Because I'm not Stephen Hawking. I can't lay out all the equations in my head. Of course, he was forced to.
Okay,
And he was
thanks.
a little smarter than I am. Adam?
So I might spin off of Peter's paper. I guess sort of I see the clustering failure as not so much about fMRI and its problems with the underlying signal. I think it's one example of several dozen ways in which biomedical researchers have been fooling themselves, right? So it sort of ties into the stuff that I talked about last week, in that a number of the papers, both in neuroimaging and throughout biomedical sciences, the stats just don't work out because of the incentives that we have. We've just gotten fast and loose and are publishing a lot of things that just aren't there. So I guess my argument on your point, Peter, is those 40,000 papers, they might not look different. They might not just be there. So the Poldrack paper that I was mentioning last week argues that there is no 20 subject whole brain analysis that could possibly reach significance. So we've put a lot of things in the literature, we've done a lot of exploratory analysis, but we've claimed support for hypotheses when we didn't really have it. And I guess I just kind of think of clustering as one of the many examples of where we have tried a little bit too hard rather than being a little bit more statistically rigorous. Sorry, not really a question, just pontificating.
I would disagree that a 20 subject, or at least 20 subject per group analysis can't possibly show anything, but I would say that it can only show strong effects. That is, and I would also state that I think that they provide hints to go forward, and I would say that for anything involving humans, that it only involves 20 people from a group, whether it's a clinical trial or or something like a vitamin supplement or food supplements and so on. I'd say that it provides a hint. I know, and saying that I've now solved the brain because of 20 subjects is, even in one little tiny area of humanity, is absurd, right? Especially since your subjects might have all been graduate students, a somewhat narrow body of humanity, right? I'd say that a significant fraction, and I'm not sure what number to put on it, so I'll just make up a number, 70% of fMRI papers are wrong simply because the people doing the data analysis don't have any idea what they're doing. People do stuff that is not just bad, it's wrong. I mean, it's demonstrably wrong. And if you can figure out what they actually did in their analysis, and there are many papers out there that I think were, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily completely wrong. I think their analysis is not supportable. Whether they're wrong is a different question, really. And if you take the attitude that it's a hint towards future research, then p-value of 0.05 is not really strong evidence. I mean, people say, oh, we should use a stronger p-value and all that. But I would say, as long as you go into it with the idea that p-value of 0.04 that you get is a hint that this is the direction to go in, and it's worth exploring further. But it isn't saying 0.04 we're heroes of the universe. 0.06 we're going to be unemployed bums.
So the argument in that paper is that anything whole brain with 20 subjects is going to be underpowered.
It is underpowered.
Any hint you get is as likely to be a sign error as it is to be an actual effect. So it's as likely to nudge you in the wrong direction as it is to nudge you in the right direction. So I'm not really qualified. I'm not a statistician. Travis is going to be giving a talk on this in a couple of weeks that sort of digs a little deeper into some of these issues that Ioannidis and this is Button 2013 that tries to make this point.
Of course, the sign error, people that do single-sided t-tests in this field, in my opinion, which is the majority of people, are committing statistical malpractice in their data, with their data. So that's just my personal opinion, but that lets out 70 or 80. That by itself is probably at least 70% of the papers in the field. So at least if you do a single-sided t-test, you're only going to see positive results. If you saw if you do fMRI analysis on a single group of subjects and you see only positive results because you only said want positive results, then you'll get that. But if you do two-sided tests and you see an equal balance of positive and negative, but we don't see so much negative bold, then you should be suspicious, right? But if you don't ever look for the negative results, then you don't have any, then you weren't listening to the dog that didn't bark in the night.
I also want to chime in here just because Adam paints this sort of bleak picture at the 70, even if 70% of what is out there was actually wrong or the wrong direction. Just to put it into perspective, one of my favorite opening lectures for medical school is a dean of a school of medicine who comes out and says, 50% of what we teach you in medical school is wrong, and we don't know which 50%. That's generally how most things kind of flow. I don't think it's 70%, and I completely agree with Bob in the sense that, if you were to use statistics as the tool that they're supposed to be and say that there is this chance that even though you have a significant effect that it may actually not be there, then that is a worthwhile endeavor. Much similar to if you go searching for your keys in your house and you get, some kind of a response that says, hey, there's a 5% chance that you're in roughly the right room, you probably would use that as an indicator to send a follow-up study, whether that's your toddler into that room to find your keys, who probably lost them, or whether that is someone with better search skills than me to find them. Statistics can be a very useful tool. What I have argued for a while is that discussion sections are the enemy of most science. And in discussion sections, people take their results, whether they're significant or not, and pontificate all sorts of falsehoods on the field, including saying things like every fMRI study in the history of fMRI is incorrect. Anyway, also not a question, really just a pontification.
People don't do a lot of these methodological studies like Peter was suggesting, an excellent suggestion, I'll repeat, simply because it seems dull and it doesn't seem like it's going to solve the brain kind of thing. Certainly everything we do is underpowered. It's just Javier's results show that what does it mean now when everything is correlated with the task if you get enough data? What does that mean? I don't think anyone has any real idea. Ultimately, I think we're going to have, the way we think about the brain is not, at present, is just not going to last another 20 years. But I don't know what the right way to think about the brain is. Otherwise, I'll be buying my plane ticket to Stockholm, right? So,
I mean, in general, it's kind of like a general statement about fMRI. I mean, we haven't fully modeled the noise perfectly. We certainly don't create enough models for the signal itself, all the transients and everything, like with Javier's paper. And so, in some way, but at least so it all depends on how deeply you want to ask your question. It's like there's activation, yes, it's probably in those areas, and then when you start asking questions about differential groups or else differences in very subtleties of the activation, the magnitude, things like that, then that's where everything is approximation. So it's to some degree wrong, and you just have to sort of you usually triangulate by other experiments, by other types of evidence, and to actually enforce your argument. So, yeah.
well, I completely agree with that. That it is no small number of papers is going to establish something in this field. It's too vast a field, really, and it is in converging evidence, because we're operating with a particular method of measuring something that is kind of dicey, I mean, in our understanding of what is actually measuring. And so converging evidence that it also fits with psychological bench experiments or with drug interventions or whatever the converging evidence is. This is the only way that we're actually going to make progress. I don't think that there's going to be some, let's just take the ABC study, analyze 100,000 or 10,000 subjects, and then we'll understand the brain. I don't think that's going to happen. You can analyze it differently than we're doing now, but it's not, and more with more nuance, because you can ask more statistical questions if you have more data. But it's not going to solve the brain if that even is a concept. Solving the brain isn't even a concept, in my opinion. It's just words stuck together that sound good, like Shakespeare is, in other words. So.
Is there any way?
For historical archive,
Hope not. Is there any way that we could use another method to constrain the results of fMRI? So at the moment, it seems like we're looking for the truth within the method itself, and we're just bound by what is available to us from that. But what if we try to use something else? Suppose we could use EEG or something from the resting state data to somehow. We don't have a ground truth. That's okay. But maybe we could, through a multimodal approach, have more verisimilitude in some sort of way.
I think that's quite true, although every approach to doing that is fraught with its own methodological difficulties, is that the brain actions that cause MEG or EEG measurable changes are not exactly the same as those that cause fMRI changes, so that they don't necessarily going to give the same regions or the same sign and so on, which is then, if they're not the same, is that doesn't mean they're not convergent, right? Because there are different physics involved. But there are other approaches too that involve measurement of things about the subject that we are if you're dealing with patients that we already know about. For example, Alex Martin's work with ASD, high functioning ASD teenagers with resting state correlations, showing that if you process the data in a reasonable way, that is the Daphne way, the correlation strength of superior temporal gyrus to other areas of the brain correlates with the subject's verbal fluency skills, which is a non-imaging measurement, right? But if you analyze it and you do some other ways that are suspect, that correlation goes away. So that is a way of that's a plausibility argument. That is, we know this about these people, that they have and this doesn't apply in typicals. IQ, sex match, typical. It doesn't apply. So that it's a function. The correlation was essentially zero between the fluency skills on the same test of the typicals versus the ASDs, showing that there's something about them, and it correlates with. So that's another that's a piece of convergence, right? Especially with resting state, where we don't even have task timing to tie it down, right? It's just, does this part of the brain look like that part of the brain, which is a little bit more nebulous than task timing, right? So, where an artifact reduction is more important. But, so, converging evidence with other imaging modalities is important. I have never dealt with PET data, and I think PET data has a potential to be very useful there, but PET is so difficult. Makes fMRI look easy, right? That's why people who are doing water PET H50, H2O15, were dropped it like a hot potato when fMRI came along. But this is you're right, but it's not easy. I won't say it's difficult, because that would be mathematician speak, but it's not easy, because it requires, you can't just say, I'm going to do fMRI and I'm going to do MEG. Putting those two things together is a third level of effort, and labs that want to do that have to have someone that's focused on that. A whole postdoc, a whole staff scientist, something that's their task for several years. They can't just sort of add on a little bit of extra imaging or something and expect to make progress. It's too difficult, because I've seen some people that want to do this. I'll just do a little bit of fMRI in addition to my other experiments, and it'll be easy. It's not. As you grow up, you discover that everything is harder than it ought to be, right? And that's true. You're trying to fix something in your house or your yard or your car. Everything is at least 3 times as hard as it ought to be. And that's the good news, if it's only 3 times as hard as it ought to be, right? And then what I'm talking about certainly fits that description here, what you're talking about. But it's necessary. I don't think we could say fMRI is going to solve the brain, whatever that might be. It gives insight to the brain, but these other things do. And if you can be clever, but this is more effort to be clever in combining these things.
So can we add, just a follow-up question of that, can we add another modality like FNIRS and fMRI, both two of them, to get some more insight?
I know very little about FNIRS. I've seen, years ago, I saw some FNIRS data, and it was shot full of obvious artifact, and I don't know how people correct for that. the scalp motion of the sensors on the scalp produce gigantic artifacts far beyond, and then they're in a different place too. They're no longer measuring the same thing they were before. There's people that do simultaneous EEG and fMRI. That's a clever, a somewhat difficult thing, but it's become sort of the thing you can buy now rather than have to make up. The answer is yes, but it's not trivial to do these two things and put them together, because they're measuring different things. Although FNIRS, at least, is probably measuring something closer to fMRI than MEG is, for example, right? Because it's going to be dependent on blood changes.
Yeah, but the reason I'm asking, the biology effect is the same, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So, in terms of biology, is the blood response we are measuring, right?
It's similar anyway, yeah.
Yeah, but difference is the infrared absorption for FNIRS.
Uh-huh.
That part is different, but in terms of biology, it is quite closer. We are looking at the blood, right? So,
Yeah.
So that's why I thought we could.
Well, ideally for convergence, you'd have radically different data, but of course, the more radically different it is, the harder it is to merge too. So I think I don't have a lot of experience, so my answers to these questions are even farther off base than my answers to how much of the fMRI literature is bad. I gave you a number there that I just made up, but now if I give you an answer to this question, I don't know.
Thank you.
Sorry. Now I'm past my sell-by date. All right, so no more questions. So you all get out of here into the heat. So have fun. Thanks.